I'm Mac. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Season 2, Episode 9. I just want to give a little bit of appreciation for that alone because Season 1, we didn't make it this far. So, for that, I have to give myself a pat on the back or a shot, whatever's preferred. LOL. But yeah, welcome back. I appreciate those that tune in every month because I have realized lately that it's not the same that it was last year and it's not what I want it to be at this point. Especially last month felt very rushed and forced. And that's not really what I wanted out of this. So I appreciate those that have been along for the ride. And I think recently I've really taken the time to kind of reflect and think about what it is that I wanted out of this. And I think there's a couple different answers to that. But I think most importantly, this is my diary of my truth and the life I've been grateful to live. And it's supposed to be a creative outlet and it should never be forced. And it should never be stressful. So I need to refocus my thoughts, my feelings, and what it is that I want out of this to make it as resourceful and useful as possible to not only myself, but to you all. So, welcome back to episode 9 of season 2. Today's episode is going to be a little heavy. I've gone back and forth about what I'm going to do with this, and I actually recorded an episode last night and was so upset afterwards because I'm like, I just don't want that or like that because it felt very random and forced again. And I think a lot of what is helpful is having people on to create dialogue with. And when you're continuously creating it yourself, it can get a little repetitive and, like I've been saying, forced. So when I woke up this morning and the episode needs to come out tonight, I'm like, God, what do I do? Do I post that? Do I just stop like I did last season with August being the last month? And then I kind of thought about just September and what September is. And September is Mental Health Awareness Month. And I think I've touched on a lot of mental health components of myself and the life that I live, but I've never really got super deep into my journey with mental health because I think the story I'm going to share today is sometimes, I hate to say embarrassing for people, but it's almost taboo in a sense to speak about your mental health journey, especially the one that I was on at one point. So it's not an easy conversation for me to have, nor is it one that I like to have often. But like I said at the beginning of this intro, this podcast is supposed to be something that people can hear and be relatable and also help people through times that they may not think they're able to get through. So if I shed a couple tears, I think in the grand scheme of things, it's worth it if it helps someone on the other end that may be struggling the same struggles or fighting the same fight. So this episode is not only dedicated to my past self that really overcame something that I never thought I would, but it's also dedicated to those that are fighting a mental health battle that no one knows about, or maybe everyone knows about, or to those that have also lost their lives to mental health. So thank you for tuning in and let's get into it. So I think, as we kind of really go back, there's one specific time point within my life that my mental health was at a point of it being life-threatening. But I think in order for this story to kind of all add up, we have to really go back to the beginning of my life when I first started to be in therapy, which was probably around the age of 8. which to some may seem very alarming and concerning, and like how is an 8-year-old in therapy. But my childhood was very bizarre. My parents split very young, which I don't think that's bizarre, especially in this day and age. But things that came following my parents' divorce were very hard on me. And as a child, I just really acted out due to the mental battles I was fighting. And personally, I want to be very specific. I've always struggled with post traumatic stress disorder from life events that I'll get into some of today. And the side effects of that have always been awful. I think going back to being a child, and it gradually got worse as I got older. I really, especially as a young child, PTSD isn't a topic of conversation first and foremost. It's not like you go to first grade and you're talking to your 6 and 7 and 8-year-old classmates about the fact that you can't sleep at night because your nightmares are so vivid that you feel on edge while you're sleeping. That's just not a very common conversation to be having with other children. And so I think that was part of the problem, is I felt like I was in a world of my own and no one was there with me. And again, as a young girl, that's very complex to wrap your mind around. But I remember going to therapy, and I very vividly remembered having exercises where I would use figures to describe people and the feelings and the places. And my figures would always be alone and in different places than others. And I think that's the hardest battle with mental health, is when you think you're by yourself. Because when you're by yourself in it, it makes it seem nearly impossible to get out of. And again, where the story begins at 8 years old, when you mentally think it's going to be your forever and your life is forever going to be like this, in a weird, twisted way, you're almost like, why even live? Which is wild to think that young to have those thoughts. But I vividly remember doing this exercise where I had to describe people that had a very negative effect on my childhood with figures. And during that exercise, thinking like, why even live when your life is like this? And I was like 8. And so continuing to get help and get support as I worked through that, I think did help. And I would say from, that was probably second grade until middle school, things were okay. Took a big jump going from private school to public school in 6th grade. And I think that's where things got really rough again, because it was back to being in a box of not having any sort of support or anyone that understood me or what I was going through. And that's when it gets the worst and the hardest and the most intolerable. And that's what I really want to get across in this episode, is half the battle is having people with you in the battle. I'm going to repeat that. Half the battle is having people with you during the battle. And that's for anything in life, not just mental health. I mean, if you think about playing sports, or if we talk about a battle war, it's nearly impossible to win a soccer game playing by yourself. It's nearly impossible fighting a war fighting by yourself. That's for anything in life. It's nearly impossible to fight battles of that volume by yourself. Yeah, there's one-man sports, and there's maybe one-man fights if it's you versus one other person. But most of the time, you need support to be able to make it through. And I think that's where a lot of people find themselves struggling, is feeling alone and feeling like they have no one to go to. So as I transitioned into public school in 6th grade, going into middle school, that was very hard, because I was very different than these kids because of my background and where I was coming from and a million different things. And again, walking into this situation with mental health issues that, again, I don't outwardly really talk about or share because I don't think it defines who I am. However, it is a part of who I am, so it should be okay to be spoken on. But again, like I said at the beginning of this episode, it's just not. It's just, as a society, it's not. I even think about my parents. If they're listening to this, this is not shade or tea, but most of my upbringing, I was told to not really share or express these feelings or to go to the gym or do things to push these feelings down. And I get where their thought process may be coming from. However, that makes you feel very alone and only isolates and worsens the issue at hand. So as I go from 6th grade to middle school, that's when I truly remember it getting really, really bad, for multiple reasons. One, nobody knows me, so I'm the one girl with no friends coming to middle school, not knowing anyone. Two, my skin has always been a battle I deal with, but it got really, really, really bad in middle school. So that's obviously something to make fun of and pick on. Three, I've always been a athletically built girl, so I wouldn't say I was picked on for how I was built, but I was always looked at, stared at, comments were always made. I'll never forget in 7th grade, it was like my 3rd week of school. I didn't know anyone. I had maybe a friend that I had made at that point in time. And so I'm walking from one class to another with my AirPods in, or earbuds. AirPods probably weren't a thing then. And I felt something on my butt. And I was like, what the hell? And this guy grabbed my butt at the ripe age of like 11. And I'm like, I knew what that was, but I was just so perplexed how I got in that circumstance. And I was just like, I don't know. I felt so like violated for the first time in my life. I don't want to say for the first time, but that's the first time that had happened to me. And so I was just like, what the hell? And then that kid started to really like torture me and be like sexually, I don't want to say that's somewhat sexually assaulting someone. And he kind of terrorized me all of middle school. And then people made rumors about me and him. And it was just always something, and I think that, really brought the trauma back alive from what I dealt with during my youth. And it just kind of spiraled from there. So then I leave middle school, and that middle school fed into one high school, but I actually went to the rivalry high school because we lived on the line between the schools, and my sister ended up going to the opposing high school, and my mom wanted us to go to the same high school, rightfully so. So that's where I went, and that's when things really took a turn for the worse. And I feel like a very common denominator within my life, and I don't know why this is, and I've obviously been in and out of therapy my whole life and talked to a lot of people and undergone very intensive treatment, which I want to really dive into that here in a bit. I have never really understood the phenomenon of PTSD and specifically assault within my life. It's a very weird thing. And unfortunately, I don't think it's uncommon. I actually know for a fact it's not uncommon. I believe the statistic now is a third of the population is assaulted. I almost want to say raped within their lifetime. I'd have to double check that, but it's definitely assaulted. It might even be raped, and it might be higher at this point because I know when I was really, really undergoing treatment that it was a fourth, and that was probably 10 years ago. So yeah, it's something I really don't understand. I don't, especially with the Epstein files coming out and the whole Diddy case and all these things that are in the public eye. I really can't comprehend or understand the stem of assault, sexual abuse, rape, um, human trafficking, sex trafficking in our society. I think I have theories, you know. I think I can say we are very sexualized in the public eye. We're very sexualized in the media. I even look at my own social media, and there's a sexual component to it, right? And I think that can be empowering, but to an extent, I also think some of the behaviors within society stem from that, which I hate to admit because I think it's sad that, as humans, we have to hide, what we look like and hide who we want to be potentially in order to save ourselves from the violence of others. I think that's very bizarre. And it's sad. I mean, to go back into my childhood, I look at my childhood and I look at the times that I was assaulted. Obviously, there was one big scenario that I'll get into that didn't happen until I was 15. But even as a child, I look at the sexual exploitation that I faced and I'm like, but I didn't have Instagram, but I never wore provocative quote unquote clothes. I never showed quote unquote anything. I was 8 years old, And so where does this truly stem from? Where does the child sexual abuse, the sexual exploitation, where does that stem from? Because like I said, we can look at young women that are posting on Instagram, on Snapchat, on whatever social media platform you can think of, that are, showing their physique and what they look like to the world. And I do that. So it's a double-edged sword here, right? There's kind of a line in the sand of when is too far, and when is putting yourself out there to a point where you're putting yourself in harm's way. Like when are you at that point, right? So that's always been a battle for me because I think it's important to have confidence and be strong within yourself and be able to walk into a room and feel like your best self. But I also realize our society is what our society is. And unfortunately, women are, and men, I don't want to limit this to women, but men and women are put at harm's way sometimes for wanting to feel confident. So that's a complex, and I don't know how to feel about that, but that was a little tangent for you. So I hope you enjoyed that. But back to what I was saying, going to high school, that's when I think all the demons had slowly been brewing, right? I had faced all of these weird instances as a young child, struggled, always very much so outwardly showed when I was struggling through actions of rebellion and arguing with my mom and maybe not being kind to others. I definitely think, and I would have to sit down and interview middle school classmates of mine, but I think if they described me and maybe my behaviors in middle school and the things I would do, not that they were bad, they weren't much different than other middle school kids, but I think you could tell in middle school and high school who was struggling versus who wasn't based on the things they were doing. And I think you can even look at that as an adult. If we talk about drug addicts and people that overuse any stimulants, alcohol, anything like that, you can tell that's a coping mechanism of some sort. And I think that goes for children as well. Like, I think a lot of children, you can tell that they are going through something of some caliber based on their behaviors. I don't think it takes a psychiatrist or psychologist to call that out, but it's unfortunate because I even look at my behaviors now. Overall, I have very healthy habits, but I think sexually, and we'll get into this, I have been deeply affected because of the abuse I've endured. So back to high school. High school was another level of like sexual behaviors and exploitation, and it was kind of crazy thinking about it. I mean, not only was my, you know, circumstances I endured insane and violating, but I even think about the individual that assaulted me when I was 15, that was kind of the final shebang of what seemed to be this long, played out journey of PTSD. That was just the cherry on top in the worst way. But if we just go into that individual's life, who shall never be named, I mean, he was fighting some serious demons that no one knew. But again, if we look at this individual's behavior, let's back it up before we even get into what I went through personally. He was always the center of attention, very well known in school, always wanting to be known, talked to, always partying, always the face of the school, always in some sort of situation, trouble being talked about. And I think, unfortunately, because at this point in my life, somehow I have turned the bad emotions and anger and all of the things into remorse for this individual, because I truly think it's a very unfortunate situation that happened based off of his PTSD, right? And come to find out that this individual was like sexually abused his whole life by a male within his life. And so he turned that into violently abusing women at a young age. I mean, after what had happened to me and all these things started coming from under wraps and coming from out of the woodworks of what he had done to other women, I mean, these behaviors started in 7th grade. So when I was talking about that guy grabbing my ass in 7th grade, I mean, who I'm now speaking on was raping people in 7th grade. And I mean, if we just think about that statement, that's insane. Like, who even knows what that is in 7th grade? I mean, I did, but who even thinks about doing that in 7th grade? I mean, it's unfathomable. And so you think about that and you're like, yes, he's fucked up. Yes, that entire situation and doing that to another individual is absolutely horrific. However, think about the mind that drives you to that place. And that to me is sad. And that is what we need to look at and we need to support and help. Same with people that, school shooters, people that have intensive acts of violence on other people or other groups that may differ in opinions or politics or viewpoints. Anyone that takes anything to the point of violence or trying to end someone's life, that's a level of mental health that really needs to be looked into and studied and deserves the time and the money and the energy, because the downstream effects of events like this are catastrophic, right? So getting back into the point of this individual, we look at someone like this and we can really pull it apart and identify it as trauma response, right? Essentially, his mind thinks, okay, I was assaulted, I was taken advantage of as a little boy by a male and done all these horrific things to. In order for me to move on and get past it and work through it, I must release these feelings onto other people, is essentially the thought process behind it from how it's been described to me. And that's just, I mean, it's diabolical, right? Because then we see it's like a virus, right? Then we're just passing it along, because now we assault about 8 women between the age of, for him, between the age of 12 to now 23. And there may be more at this point. 8 is just the last I was informed on. But that's a serial rapist. That's a serious issue to have by the age of 23. And that's something to live with, right? That's the other part of this, is to be able to live through that and live with that. And my book is harder than what I'm living with, which is the consequences of what he did, right? So again, back on track to my viewpoint, my point of view of this is I go to a new high school again, changing the scene again. So again, I'm feeling alone, and not that I don't know anyone, and back to square one essentially. And that's a continuous thing within my life, is feeling like I don't belong. And a lot of those are my demons, but a lot of them are the reality of my situations. I think for any kid that went from school to school to school, it's difficult, and I'm an outgoing cat. So for it to be difficult for me, I can only imagine my sister, who's not outgoing. It must have been 10 times as hard. But coming into these situations with PTSD and just trauma, and my brain is always on alert and all the things, it was hard. And I feel like freshman year was decent, and I, made friends and found my people and played soccer and whatever. And then sophomore year comes around, and that's when things really took a turn. I think physically there was a lot of components with soccer. Soccer was my outlet, and things started tanking there come sophomore year. And that played a mental toll. And then I meet the guy that I was just speaking about, who, unbeknownst to me, had serious mental health issues. And again, unbeknownst to me, had a history of sexual assault with the partners within his life. And so, of all people for me to end up with, this was the last person. Somehow it still fell right in my lap. And, I blur out a lot of these memories and these situations and these instances, but I think for as much as I can remember, there were signs. And I'll never forget one. I don't think I've ever told this story on here, and if I have, forgive me, but at least one of you haven't heard it before, and it means something to you, then well, so be it. I'll never forget the most alarming part of our whole relationship and of this whole situation that has now played a pretty massive effect on my life was, like I said, there was 2 high schools within the school district that I went to, and that was a big rivalry. And so when I was a sophomore, when I was in cahoots with him, I went to this game that was the rivalry high school game. And so, of course, I saw my old friends from middle school at the other bleachers for the other school. And then me and my friends and family were on the bleachers of our school. And I'll never forget going to the opposing school and saying hello to all my friends as I'm walking out, someone, have no idea who they are to this day, couldn't even give you a clue, but they went to that high school, the opposing high school, and they asked me what my name was, and I told them, and they said, "Oh, you're the girl that's dating a rapist." Yeah, some silence there, because what do you say to that at 15 years old? What do you say to that? Especially, again, let's keep in mind the background of me and my story and what I've been through, which I've kept it very PG up until this point. But that's very alarming to me, and obviously I full-fledged panicked because I had never heard this up until this point. And sad enough, that was 2 weeks to the day before I was, beaten unconscious and raped. And so I look at that time frame right there, and I think to myself, God, you really could have dodged a bullet. But unfortunately, the mind of a young person, and the mind of, anyone really, but if we dissect it, 15-year-old female, loved and cared for this individual. It's like my first real boyfriend. And obviously having that trauma mindset of the attachment portion of it, it was a complex. It was such a complex. So of course I call him. He comes to my house, says it's a lie. I call the girl that they're claiming he did this to. I know. and have a close relationship with. And she also lies and says it didn't happen. And then once it happens to me, she's like, oh yeah, by the way, that did happen. It was just the most mind fucking thing someone, especially at that age, could have gone through. I'm told out of nowhere that my partner is a serial rapist. I then question this. I'm then made to feel delusional by even questioning this. My family's made to feel delusional because my mom was at this game with me. So this was just complete anarchy. Like, it was just insane. And so we were supposed to go to homecoming the next week. We go to homecoming the week following. Really weird day that ended in me getting violently assaulted by him, right? And I don't think it's necessary to get too deep into that, but I think, like I shared, that whole circumstance, that whole situation from start to end was just, I mean, it was bad. Because then it happens, and it was the wildest thing, because I'm not lying. As soon as I wake up from that situation happening, it was almost like the world erased it, right? And then we're back in the conversation of feeling alone, because not only did I go through that and have to live through that and walk that walk, but I then am trying to get to the other side, but the whole entire world is acting like it never happened. But it happened, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is, it's not that people said I was a liar, or they didn't believe me, or whatever circumstance could have came out of that. They believed me. They agreed with me, but they didn't care. Like, that was the most mind-blowing part, is it's not that people thought I was lying, because I think a lot of times with assault and rape, because people definitely weaponize those words, you know, there's an authenticity component of assault, rape, anything that can, you know, catastrophically ruin someone's life. But that was never the issue with my situation. It's not that people didn't believe me, it's that people didn't give a fuck. And it was the most bizarre thing. I swear to God, I felt like I wasn't on earth for like 4 years of my life, because I had to stop going to school. When I went back to school, he goes to school with me. So they then had to set my schedule to where I left classes 5 minutes early so we didn't see each other in the hallway, because he would like terrorize me in the hallway and like wait for me in places that he knew I was and make comments about it. And I'll never forget, like, the next year, so a year later, there was a chant at the high school football game about it. Like, I can't make this up. I literally, like, this shit really needs to be a movie. And I say that all the time, but this was like the most unfortunate, intensive, disgusting circumstances for a American high school student, I swear to God, on paper. It was literally like I was living euphoria. And it was almost like he was praised for these actions. And then the weirdest part about it was all the people that were there during the situation that were, you know, in our friend group and stuff. One of the girls that like helped me get through it started dating him. And then all his friends like made me feel like I was mentally ill and that I needed to be put away. Like, it was diabolical. I keep saying that, but it was truly, when I pull it apart, the most horrific situation I've ever lived through. So again, this episode isn't necessarily about assault or rape. It's more about the mental health component of it, which that's, you know, I share that story at a very surface level because there's a lot of details I didn't include for the sake of your guys' time and mental. However, let's talk about the mental component of this, right? So first of all, PTSD, which has been a common denominator within my life, is a pretty extreme mental health condition that has shown up in multiple different forms in my life, right? It's shown up in me retaliating and having rage and anger and depression and anxiety and all these things. But it wasn't until this story, this situation, that I ever saw some extreme side effects like hearing things and seeing things and believing things that weren't real, and a level of mentally unwell that is what I put in the life-threatening bracket, because surviving that, right? And again, I don't want to be super graphic because I don't think this will necessarily change things, but I just also want you to understand there's levels to this, and there's also levels to PTSD, and how the side effects can show and how it affects people differently and all the things. But I think of people that are, traumatized by war and anything of violence. Obviously, the rape is a huge component of it, but I kind of think at this point in my life, as I can openly talk about it, I think the violence was the worst part, because I'll never forget, probably a year, maybe 2 years afterwards, which is crazy, the hardest battle was the side effects of the trauma, which one was, again, hearing things and seeing things that weren't there, which sounds insane. I mean, there's really no way of putting it, and it's insane to even talk about, because I don't have that anymore. I don't struggle with that anymore, and that's not, thank God, something that I experienced. But the last thing I remember when I was being raped was me screaming and crying for help because no one was there to hear me. But I was hoping someone walked by my house and heard and broke in, like, because I was in such fear of my life. And so for like 2 years afterwards, I would hear someone screaming for help that wasn't ever there. And again, that sounds insane, but to anyone that's lived through this, you get how insane it feels living through it, right? And the worst part was I would hear them screaming for me, right? Like, I'd hear my name and no one was there. And it was not only scary, but it was every single time I heard that, I relived it. And so it was like every day I was reliving the worst day of my life. It was like fucking Groundhog's Day. I'm telling you, it sickens me when people make light of, joke about, or just don't even acknowledge mental health thinking about this version of who I was, right? Sorry. Let me get a breath. Because I was 15 years old, again, living that every day. And I don't wish that on anyone. I don't wish that on my worst enemy. Like, it was absolutely horrific. It was horrific. And then again, like I said, the fact people thought it was funny, and when I do finally go back to school, people are making jokes about it, and people are making jokes about me and me being crazy, and me, because I think one part of this that is very sad, and I don't want this to scare people, or for anyone dealing with anything even remotely similar to this, for this to worry you, but when I went through that, I was never the same person. And I'm still not, I'm a totally different person. And we, as we grow and change in life, that's natural. But when I say a night and day switch, I mean 360 or 180, I guess is what they say. But I'll die on the 360 hill. But anyway, like, my spirit died. And I didn't talk, and I didn't look people in the eyes, and because my mind was not ever the same. And so again, today, I know today's episode is about mental health and being an advocate and bringing light to this, because it's a very important topic of conversation. But when I say I lost everything and I was a different person, like, I was soulless. And I think the side effects were a huge portion. I mean, hearing things, seeing things, the anxiety, the not being able to sleep. I mean, if we dissect PTSD, it's a very deep mind fucking disorder. I mean, I didn't sleep for, approximately 6 months of my life until I got a drug that helped me sleep. But every time I would fall asleep, I would wake up to the fact that I felt like I was being raped in my sleep. I mean, every single night. Again, it was Groundhog's Day. It was the same thing over and over again. So finally, I got treatment pretty quickly after the situation because it was an immediate life-changing event. But there's a lot of different treatments that I'd like to talk about today that I think can be beneficial to people that may, again, I'm speaking directly about post-traumatic stress disorder and, depression and anxiety forms. I personally can't speak to other disorders, but I know that all of these treatments are used in multiple different formalities. So I want to reference that as I go into the conversation of treatments following an event like this. So initially I was put on a lot of medication, and unfortunately that's never been a helpful form of relief for me. It only stripped my soul more, I felt. Yeah, I didn't hear things, I didn't see things, I didn't have anxiety, I didn't have depression. And so it was a bandage for sure. It was a temporary help so that I hate to say it like this, but I didn't end my life. However, I'll never forget sitting in math class, worst time of my life, but her doing math on the board and it just going right above me. Like I couldn't grasp anything, I couldn't feel anything, I couldn't hear anything. It was like I was just living and I had absolutely no feeling, emotion, or even mental intelligence. Like I felt like I had no mind or soul. And in a way, I felt like that was worse than all the side effects because I kept telling my doctors, like, I feel like a zombie. I didn't know how to put it besides that. Like, I literally felt so anti-human, like non-human, I guess is the verbiage I'd use. But it was horrible. So I get off those drugs and they're like, okay, we're going to try some intensive therapies then. I'm like, okay. So the first one I tried, I found a little too intense to start with, but it was bad. I mean, I was telling my parents almost every day or someone in my life that I was worried about myself because it was bad. There's no way to put it except for that. So treatment. I want to just directly talk about what works. Let's start there. I have to thank two doctors specifically, Dr. Nicole Generlinick at the Linder Center of Hope in Mason, Ohio. And, oh goodness, I'm blanking on her name, but she was an EMDR specialist at the Linder Center of Hope in Mason, Ohio as well, which, again, I have to give a lot of credit to that mental health facility that's in Cincinnati, Ohio, for truly creating an environment that got me through the darkest time of my life. And a therapy that was very life-changing for me is something that's called EMDR. And it stands for Eye Movement Desensitization Response, I believe. You can fact check me on that. But there is studies, and if you go on my TikTok, you see I repost it all the time because I'm very passionate about EMDR and making sure people are educated on it and have an understanding on the treatment and what it is. But it's intensive trauma treatment for every type of trauma disorder. And essentially the science behind it is that when discussing trauma, they have found that there is a lot of eye movement involved, which is interesting. But if you want to look into it yourself, obviously you're more than welcome to. But if you also want to physically kind of test this theory, if you are talking about a traumatic event with someone, look at their eyes and you'll see the movement is sporadic. Like their eyes are all over the place because there is science that shows when your brain is trying to process trauma, your eyes are involved in that process. And they have a deep connection and correlation. And they found through this therapy, they can get your eyes to move at a constant, slow pace. And it helps process the trauma, unlike any other therapy. And it's incredible. And so essentially, it was like therapy. You'd go and talk about the things and talk about an action plan, typical therapy. However, the difference with this is the entire time she would be moving her finger in a pattern, like an eye exam almost, while you tell the story. Which sounds kind of crazy, like you're moving your eyes back and forth in a line and in different motions and ranges while you're talking for an hour, maybe two. It's kind of, I hate to put it this way, but it's very hypnosis giving. Like that's kind of what I describe it as. But all I can say is it's the most rewarding therapy I've ever done. And I did this therapy treatment for probably about a year, and then I stopped when I saw things get better. And then again, I think as COVID came, it got really bad again. And actually it was during COVID. It got really bad again, and I think it was the loneliness away from the world component of things. And October of 2020 is a very dark time of my life. And to get some background on that, October is always a very hard time for me because every catastrophic event that's ever taken place in my life has happened in October. And back to the original statement I made at the beginning of this podcast, I don't know why there's patterns within my life, but I always recognize there's a reason for every season, and I accept and appreciate what comes with everything as it comes. But I do try to be cautious and cognizant during October and during the fall because there is a pattern within my life for that. So anyway, October of 22 was a very, very dark time of my life where I tried to take my own life. And I hate to admit that, I hate to talk about this time. I hate to talk about my time being in a mental health facility on a long-term basis. But I think it's important to talk about, and I don't want to say normalize, but say that that's okay. Because I think going, again, to the Linder Center of Hope on an inpatient term, it absolutely changed my life. So to conclude this, I just, want everyone to know that this is a very common phrase, but it's okay to not be okay, first and foremost. I think the stigma, today talking about assault, stigma. Being in an inpatient mental health facility, aka a psych ward, very stigmatized, very hush-hush, not a topic of conversation very often. So trust and believe I understand what it's like to live in a stigma world where you feel like you can't speak up about this. But the issue within our society and why mental health is such a problem and one of the leading causes of death at this point is because people feel like they can't talk about it. And people feel like they're crazy. And people feel alone. And being alone is half the battle. Because this is not something you can do by yourself. And so going to the Linder Center of Hope, like I was saying, was the most life-changing thing for me because two things. I finally got to the point where I realized you can either continue to be bitter about this or you have to find a way to cope and become better. And is experiencing what I've experienced from 15 to 18 normal? No. And do I wish it on my worst enemy? God, no. However, I now have the perspective and the understanding because of the therapy and the support that I was given during that time that I can be better because of this. I look at myself now and I'm in a situation now that 99.9% of 22-year-olds aren't in. And a lot of people are like, wow, how did you get to that point? And in a weird, fucked up way, I have to say, what I went through not only matured me at a rate of speed that's hard to wrap your mind around, but it also kind of made me invincible in a way, because if you can overcome everything I shared today, then fuck, you can do anything, right? And so I continue to support and push those around me to be better, It's okay to not be okay. It's okay to need help. It's okay to call your friends and need support. I mean, anyone listening to this, my DMs are always open and you're more than welcome to reach out to me, and I'm there as much as I can be to support you through whatever it is you're going through. But it all starts with you, And you have to know that your life is worth living and that there is another side. And unfortunately, a lot of people are pushed to a place and are put in a place where they don't think that, and it's heart-wrenching, and it's something that's not right to me, and I hate to see those in that situation, because I was there, I was in a place where I thought I couldn't live anymore, and I couldn't live with the pain and the thoughts and the feelings and the people around me and what they thought and what they said. And, this is your life and you only get one, to our knowledge. Shit, I hope we have a couple. That'd be pretty cool. But always know, no matter what it is, even, the individual I was talking about earlier that did this to me, I wish him nothing but, a bitter-free life and a pain-free life. And I want everyone to win, no matter what you've been through, what you've experienced, what you've done to others. Every day is a new day to start again. And always remember, you're never alone. So thank you so much for tuning in to Season 2, Episode 9 of Save the Best for Last. I appreciate that you all sat and truly listened to not only my experience, but my thoughts and feelings towards the mental health crisis that we are currently facing in this world. And I hope this was informational. I hope this maybe gave you a newfound perspective if you don't struggle with this. And for those that do, I hope you know you're not alone. And I hope you know you're in this together, and I'm always here, and today's a new day. So peace be to all of you. May love and gratitude fill your soul. And may you every day choose to wake up and choose better. Scratch that. Choose better over bitter. And always know that the sun will shine, and that's why I love tomorrow, as Glorilla says. So thank you again for taking the time to spend your day with me. May October be filled of peace, love, and happiness. Like I said, October is sometimes a risky month for me, so say a prayer or two. But it's going to be a good one. I feel it. And for those that are, struggling, my thoughts are with you. And my DMs are always open, so remember that. Again, I appreciate you all for checking out this episode. I'll be back October 30th first. I think there's 31 days in October. Sounds right. Anyway, have a great rest of your September, and I'll see you in October. Bye.